Hello everyone, it is Ty Carr here and welcome to another None of Our Businesses YouTube show and podcast. We've got 7 articles that we're reviewing today. As always, we're looking at the news and accounting, tax, business from accountants' perspectives. So, what do we have coming up? Well, employees are blowing the whistle on companies like never before with the Securities Exchange Commission. Albertsons laying off employees and replacing with gig workers. Producing management reports. Is faster always better? Businesses being affected by politics. Does that open up opportunities? Megatrends for accountants. All right, woohoo! And why Elon Musk tweet leads to a surge in Signal Advance stock. Should members of Congress be getting public pensions? And finally, earn more from your accounting cleanup projects. Well, those are today's topics. Let's get into it. AJ, take it away for us.
All right, our first article comes our way of Accounting Today. So the headline reads, Whistleblowing soars to record with America's working from home. And what this is I guess the work from home phenomenon has triggered a fresh frustration for U.S. corporations. Americans are blowing the whistle on their employers like never before. And so this has to do with large public companies and the SEC's receiving 6,900 tips alleging that white-collar crime has risen during the fiscal year that ended September 30th by 31% from the previous 12 months. So in reading through, I guess, I hadn't even thought about this, but with meetings online with Zoom, and you don't even need Zoom to record your meetings like we do for the podcast. You can have an external capture card or even use OBS or VLC to record meetings without anybody knowing it. You have access, I guess, to record all these kind of meetings and such, and have, everything is basically put into an email now and documented through a Slack channel or through a TeamSpeak channel that you have access to, basically a transcript of all your communications. And so they've talked about how that has kind of fueled more evidence-based and more whistleblowing that goes on. The other side of this is I guess that the SEC is incentivizing more with larger rewards for whistleblowers. And so I'd like to get your guys' take. Maybe, do we see a move to remote work causing, I guess, firms, even small businesses, to operate, kind of a larger HR role, or have basically, more stringent rules, or having to levy more stringent rules around what's said at work, what's said on a Slack channel, outside of just a public company that could have, of course, financial wrongdoing or regular wrongdoing from a HIPAA or a OSHA or compliance standpoint, but even for smaller firms for harassment or anything like that. So I'd like to get your guys' take, because this is something that I hadn't thought about with remote work and essentially everything being online now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it sounds like it makes a whole lot of sense that this kind of issue would rise. And it sounds like a really good thing, kind of a good side effect of the whole issue, that basically all these things are becoming more data-driven and more able to be referenced in making these kinds of cases. And I think also the other thing is that just the chaos that's gone on since the pandemic has ensued. You have at the same time people moving towards these technologies, but that's also happening during a very chaotic time, when I think that would lend itself well to these kinds of issues happening more naturally. And so, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, one of the pieces of this article that I found interesting was that whistleblower payments only came into effect 10 years ago under Dodd-Frank. Before that, whistleblowers weren't being paid. And so they were just doing it out of the kindness of their own hearts, and often paying severe consequences as a result. So I think a little cash incentive, along with some accountability of having yourself recorded, can go a long way. And I can say personally, I've sat in some meetings, some uncomfortable meetings where, higher ups would say something like, well, don't tell anybody I said this, but, and then they tell you what they really think. And you're like, this is so not appropriate. This is way out of bounds. So I think this level of accountability of having things recorded and filmed makes people perhaps behave more professionally, or, sheds light on those who can't.
I think one of the things this article brought out, I think it said it in there. I mean, it's kind of human nature. you don't have to necessarily go in and face these people. It makes it a whole lot easier to report what you know when you don't have to go in there and walk by that desk every day or see them every day. And I think that's one of the things that I got out of that article, that it would be a natural increase because it's just human nature. It makes it a whole lot easier.
Yeah, I think another interesting thing I thought of, and we've always talked about on this podcast about like what the future looks like for our industry. And I think one of the things that is going to be in everybody's future is being comfortable on camera like this, or being comfortable in a digital medium and being able to, convey messages via text, via video, via email. I think those are all important skills that I don't think maybe we even thought would be so strongly leveraged even 12 to 18 months ago, or 2 years ago or so, although they were on the increase, but I don't know if we would have put as much of an emphasis on it as now. You got another article for us, Charlie?
Yeah, I've got one on kind of a different vein here. In the Washington Post, there was an article called Albertsons is laying off employees and replacing them with gig workers as app platforms rise. And so the article is looking at Albertsons, who went public last year and then shortly after has made the decision to get rid of a lot of its delivery staff and replace them, like the article title said, with these third-party services like DoorDash and Uber and these kinds of things. And so it's all kind of, it depends on who you ask. A lot of people will say that it's related to, of course, this Prop 22 that we've talked about on the podcast a couple of times. If you ask Albertsons, it has nothing to do with that. It's just a big coincidence, but that's what they say. And so I guess I just wanted to talk on it a little bit. I know we've discussed it a few times on the podcast, but it's maybe starting to expand into more areas than it had previously, and want to get your guys' take on, I guess, do you believe Albertsons when they say that this change has nothing to do with Prop 22, or is this maybe more indicative of kind of a standard that's being set that other businesses will be forced to follow as soon as third-party options become available to replace employees?
I thought this article was really interesting, Charlie, because we've talked about the switch from gig workers and the different kind of, prop, like for instance, we talked about the Prop 20 or whatever it was that passed in California that essentially, allowed people to continue working as a gig worker and independent contractor, and Uber and all, DoorDash and all those other companies flooded the, essentially the airwaves with, for lack of a better word, propaganda towards, a pro for voting yes on that ballot measure. What I find interesting, though, and one thing that we've talked about on the podcast before, is this has really made like delivery service commoditized. So if you're like a mom and pop pizza business, you no longer are required or you have an alternative to hiring a full-time employee to be your delivery driver. You can now go to DoorDash and pay a fee to have an on-demand, essentially, delivery person that you don't need to monitor or worry about showing up for work on time or paying the employer-employee payroll tax portion, any of that stuff, providing any kind of benefits or minimum wage to. You just hire out the delivery on and it really has commoditized a service that used to be staffed by, with an employee of the restaurant. So now you kind of have commoditized the delivery portion of what used to be a full-time or a part-time gig that somebody would be an employee for. So I think it's an interesting shift, and you even see it with these, grocery delivery services, where now the delivery portion of it is commoditized and is being handled almost the same way as you would send like a package if you're a manufacturing company of your product, So I think it's an interesting switch, and I think it's something we'll see more of especially larger companies, but even small companies, I think, shedding employees in favor of like a gig type delivery worker, especially in that kind of sector.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you, AJ, but I also kind of start thinking about the future implications of this. I know personally I've ordered meals from Postmates or gotten ready to push the button to order that meal, and then I see there's this like $25 surge pricing because of the time of day that I want this meal. And it's like, really? So now if everybody starts using gig workers to do their deliveries, it's like, well, I better get my delivery at a slow time of day. Otherwise, I'm going to be paying a premium to just get something delivered to my house. And it starts looking less convenient for the consumer. And, granted, the gig worker delivery drivers may just be an employee base that is shrinking and we'll never see it again. But the gig workers, you got to have enough gig workers in your area to be able to fulfill the need to deliver groceries, deliver prescriptions, whatever those things might be. And then, their wages rise as they deliver at the busy times. So, it's a whole new industry that's kind of, and if this podcast can, it will look at it from every single angle.
Yeah, the only other thing I thought it was interesting in the article that I wanted to mention is just that they talked about the mechanics of pay and how, like, for example, when DoorDash drivers are in between deliveries, how they're not getting paid, but that the minimum wage laws would normally have that time be kind of a paid time. And so it's kind of like an interesting way that companies can use this to circumvent these sorts of laws that are really there just for employees' safety and fairness. So yeah, do you have another article we can talk about, Mark?
You bet. I found this one kind of inside baseball, but interesting. It's from a management accounting publication called Producing Management Reports Faster. It is the metric of the month. And, it's interesting because as we as accountants are kind of in the end of month, end of year cycle, and January is considered one of the more busy and /stressful months for accountants. Seeing an article about the cycle time it takes to deliver month-end reports, a top performer will deliver those reports within 7 days of a closing month, and then a bottom performer will take 16 days or longer. And they talk about how in order to get that speed up, you're going to need to have a lot of different aspects of the company on the same page, particularly management, like CFO role positions, be more active throughout the process and not just come in at the tail end and start barking orders and saying, we need to get this done. We need to get this done. So, the tips that this article offers is clarifying roles and responsibilities, make sure everybody who's working on specific things knows what they're doing, has a timeline, do some of the heavy lifting that you can do up front so that you're not, coming in at the tail end and doing tasks that you could have done before the month even closed. And then, of course, high quality data and automating things as you can. So I thought this was interesting because there always seems to be a push-pull between clients who want things closed really fast and then, wanting as complex and complete a data set as possible for the month. So given that we're all kind of in the same boat, I'm curious what some of you think.
This one, man, this one totally struck a nerve with me because I've worked in all kinds of phases of accounting, finance, but probably management reporting and management reports is probably one of the ones that runs nearest and dearest to me. And as I was reading that article, I was laughing because you'll always go through, the salespeople will come in and say, this is a great report. You can put it on the desktop and anybody can run it with the push of a button. Well, that might be true of a very, very small company where the CFO is the bookkeeper, is the chief cook and bottle washer, all those things. But as you started getting any company with any type of size, I'm telling you, executives, I don't care how easy you make it, they are not going to run their own reports. They're going to be looking for somebody else to run those reports. And the thing that I most often see is they fail to understand the downstream. So they'll want to see 6, 7, 8 different scenarios, but you're doing it with the reporting package that doesn't support multiple scenarios, or worse yet, you have these multiple, offline manual entries, and they'll say, well, let me see it with this. Let me see it with this plus this. And these are all manual offline entries, which the last thing you want to do is give executive management a report that's wrong. So, you've got people spending days and days and days chasing their tail, trying to put together these reports to present them to management. And it's either management hasn't given them the tools, the direction. The one thing I did like in the article, they talked about CFOs getting in there and being more of a communicating, letting people know what comes down the pike. But, one of the biggest disconnects that I always see on this is as companies grow and the complexity gets more increased, they want to keep supporting all these different scenarios, but they never understand the downstream impact of what all these last minute changes are. You're sending a lot of people scurrying around, making sure everything ticks and everything ties before it gets back up to management. So to that earliest point, I always laugh at the salesman that says, "Oh, you just push a button and you'll get a report." I've never seen an executive yet that runs their own report. They're gonna push it downstream, and they're gonna have it get pushed back upstream. But curious to hear what your guys' experiences have been.
Yeah, I got to agree with you, Jack. I have not seen a lot of owners who are really interested in doing that. The other thing that I've found that I think is kind of interesting and maybe counterintuitive is that a lot of times the people who want the reports the fastest will hone in on maybe one piece of information that they think is the real deal, and they'll use that. They'll want that quick, and they'll get that, and then they'll feel like they're done. And instead of doing any kind of more thorough analysis on a prior month, or maybe having the financials lead to some conclusion that they can implement in their business, they just want to know how they did, and they want to know now. And as soon as they know, they're done. There's nothing, no more discussion. And so I think that can be, when you rush to get the answer, instead of taking your time and kind of pondering, maybe let's not rush this next answer. Let's make sure that we've thought of everything we need to think about with the prior month before we jump in to the next month. Even if that means delaying a close, I think it can still have value.
I think the one thing that hit home for me was, well, first of all, we work with a client and we're able to turn around a report by the 5th, which I felt pretty good about, that we're above the top performer for sales data. But the other part that I found interesting was the part that talks about management being involved in the close or report process, and to be able to understand what it takes to make that report available and what goes into, or what downstream is happening in the reporting process. So we all know garbage in, garbage out. If you don't have good numbers and you don't have a solid close, and I think that's probably the foundation of where your reporting is coming from, then you're not going to have a timely report, and you're not going to have a very good report. And so I think knowing everything that goes into the numbers that come out that need to be reported on the sales reporting or financial reporting is super important. But at the very least, understanding what goes into it and the time that it takes, because you're not going to be able to shrink the time that it takes to prepare these reports or to make these closes without understanding the pieces that go into it and finding a way to streamline or make it easier for the people downstream to do the reporting. And a lot of times the people that are doing the reporting, they don't have extra time to figure out a quicker way to do it. This is the way we've done it. And so they continue the old way of doing it because that's the way they've been doing it. And we're able to get it in by your deadline, whether it be the 24th hour or the 21st hour, it gets done. But I think it takes somebody that's not in the weeds, I guess, to look at it and say, what if we did this? Or your base information is coming from here. Can we extract that easier than you having to, create 20 pivot tables and run various scenarios with it? So I think, yeah, a view that's not so much, involved with the day-to-day data is immeasurable to be able to look at it from an objective point of view and shrink that time, I think.
My 2 cents on it is that, I think the article is okay from the standpoint that it inspires some conversation, and, it creates some of these thoughts and good ideas about, well, how can we be better at what we're doing? But I think it's too high level and too, it just strikes me as very naive, right? It's investment neutral in terms of the way it's written. It's like, well, the reality, from my perspective, when we're working with clients, our smaller clients are going to have longer close times than our larger clients because, which is almost counterintuitive, right? Because you look at it and you're like, well, a smaller client is easier, right? But it's not investment neutral. The reality of closing the books and getting management reports out is not investment neutral. It depends how many resources you throw at it. And a larger client that has more demands on that kind of reporting is going to throw more resources at it. So typically what I see is larger companies that have more resources to throw at a close process are going to close quicker. Smaller businesses that have fewer resources to close at a close process are going to take longer to close. And that's reasonable. It's like, well, if your business is doing less than $1 million a year in sales, it's not so critical that you have this information. Where the decisions you make and the risks that you take, right? Everything's relative here, right? So saying, well, I have to know my information within 5 days, but what's on the line is relatively small compared to a larger business. That's, to me, that's where all this comes together, where the rubber meets the road. So, and then, just the just the data that's being cited, this idea that high performing teams have shorter cycles based on data that they pulled from some performance data. I mean, how did they know, how did they judge what a high performing team was and making that kind of assessment? So I find the conclusion that they're drawing and their data source suspect, but I think that the conversation it inspires is a worthwhile conversation. We all want to get better, but what that actually means on a comparative basis, I'm not sure this article has data that is really convincing to me on a comparative basis. And like I said, especially since it talks about it in an investment neutral way.
Hey, Jack, you got an article for us?
I do. Probably noticed in the news a lot of big tech making a lot of big moves, but let's talk in particular about some of the moves as they involve Parler. So Parler pretty much overnight essentially got put out of business. I think they're scrambling now to find another provider, but I guess my takeaway would be from a business standpoint, it's a little jaw-dropping that you could that I guess Parler didn't take steps to ensure that they couldn't get put out of business overnight in such a manner. I mean, you see it a lot of times with manufacturers, they'll have 2, 3, 4 different suppliers. One supplier has a problem, they go to the second one. It's a little jaw-dropping that they would put themselves in a position to basically put their entire business at risk, with the decision of one tech company. So I guess the other angle I would look at it is, is there an opportunity there to build some infrastructure to where there's choices, there's options. I mean, that's the the essence of being an entrepreneur. You look for these, you look for a need and you fill it. So I think people up until this point have been very happy to go with the main players and technology. I think in this case it was Amazon that took them off their servers, but I think there's an opportunity there for entrepreneurs that maybe want to build some other platforms. And then I think, you keep everybody honest that way. And I think, you take a company like Parler, somebody kicks you off on Sunday night, by Monday, Tuesday, you're back up and running on a competitor. So I think, from a business standpoint, I see some entrepreneurial possibilities there. What do you guys think?
Jack, I'm gonna largely agree with what you say, because I think it is a problem when rules of the road are applied inconsistently, because I think Parler was taken off the air primarily for its content, but then you have Twitter that's posting content that is offensive left, right, and center, and keeps saying we're not responsible for our content. We're just a provider that just funnels it through, but yet somebody like Parler isn't held to that same standard. I think Parler has already moved to a new platform, Epic, which hosts InfoWars and some other so they're in the process of moving. It just is an interruption in business, but there are other platforms out there besides Amazon, Google Cloud, Oracle, other platforms that could have stepped up and said, hey, we understand what you're trying to do. Even if we don't agree with the content, we agree with the idea that we should be business agnostic and allowing other businesses to, we should all play by the same rules, I guess is what I'm saying. But I'm curious what else some of you guys think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, your uptime is a product of the partners that you choose to use, but it's also a product of the nature of what your tool does. And so I think that, there's one angle of it of like, well, how do we keep this tool up and running? And are we using the right service providers to do that? Another angle would be to say, let's make sure that our tool is not, I don't want to say controversial, but, that our tool is usable enough by a large enough group of people that it doesn't subject itself to a lot of these types of challenges that Parler found itself in. And so I think there's kind of two angles to how do you keep a business up and running. It's like having good service partners, but also having a business model that isn't as polarizing maybe as some people find. Not just this, but other businesses as well. What do you think, AJ?
I agree with everything you guys said. I think Ty had something to say on it.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to weigh in and say that, along the lines of what you guys said, it's a heads up for me that, and a reminder that, business is not always apolitical, that politics can affect business and that it can, and then Jack, I think you're right that it can lead to opportunities in different kinds of industries. I remember as an accountant over a couple decades ago, or early on, I guess, in my accounting, being surprised or realizing, because I generally approach business as kind of apolitically as I can in most cases. But I remember early on realizing that in the accounting industry, there's actually accountants that specifically they serve political campaigns, that you can get on the inside of either the Democratic or the Republican campaigns, and you can work within those circles, and your whole career can be basically shaped by your connections and your politics, so to speak, in that way. And it just seemed like such an intriguing thought to me, because it was like so foreign to anything that I do, in terms of not really taking a side and kind of running my business in that way. I kind of keep my politics as much as possible in my personal life. So yeah, I think, the heads up on this point that, yeah, business can affect politics, and it most certainly can open opportunities. And I think, whatever else you can say about the divisive politics and the divides in our nation, I think we probably will see business opportunities, so to speak, that come out of the divides to some extent.
I will have to say I saw one amazing thing kind of come up from the Capitol storming. We don't have to keep this in the podcast if we don't want to, but there was 2 young African-American men that were selling like pro-Trump sweatshirts, and they went by the name of Nunya, and don't ask me my effing name is what they were quoted in the article saying. And their line was, I don't believe in any of this any of this shit. I'm just selling this I'm just selling these $100 sweatshirts to put myself through college. And so I think there's an opportunity there for anybody, regardless of what side of the aisle you come from, that, hey, like Michael Jordan said, Republicans buy shoes too. So I guess if you're apolitical, if you're willing to swallow your political pride, there's money to be made out there on either side of the divide, I guess.
Right.
Maybe we could get Nunya to sponsor our podcast. It's kind of on brand.
Right. So true. All right. Another article from Accounting Today. So the Institute of Management Accountants president and CEO basically came out and said there's 6 mega trends for accountants this year and going forward. And so it kind of bullet pointed his thoughts here, but it was kind of interesting because I think it's parroting almost what we've said here. And maybe there's 1 or 2 that we haven't discussed on the podcast before, but I like your guys' take on the 6. So an increasing amount of automation, remote work being the norm for finance teams, environmental, social, and governance reporting growing in importance. So the, more importance on like a yearly or annual like sustainability reporting, or a kind of an overall state of the business report as opposed to just financial reports. Finance professionals being held accountable for enterprise risk management, diversity, equity, and inclusion becoming a more competitive differentiator, and increasing demand for upskilling and continuing education for professionals. So my thought is there anything that's surprising to anybody, or is there anything that he might have left out that you think are kind of going trends, or, looking to the future of our industry that he may have missed? And granted, this comes from a managerial accountant's perspective. So maybe he's missed something in like the public sector, or So I'd like to get your guys' take on it.
I guess would depend a little on the sustainability, if that is including all of IT functions, because one of the things that I've noticed is audits, it always used to be finance and accounting, but if you go through an audit now, they spend a whole heck of a lot of time with IT. So I would look at the sustainability piece of how much are they really targeting the business continuity, the security, those types of things, where is that part of that sustainability? If that goes down, and are they holding the accountants responsible for tracking that to make sure that they have things in place to make sure those things don't happen? Is that part of the sustainability?
Yeah, I gotta agree with that. I think that is a key part to it, and it seems to be an ever increasing part of kind of what we do, is this whole data integrity and security kind of a thing. And so it seems to me like a trend that's just going to continue as as we go more and more into remote work. So yeah, but I think the other things the article touches on are also true and are good things to watch out for in the industry, because they're definitely not going away.
I will circle back here. I think one of the things that I saw in here that kind of raised my eyebrows is finance professionals being held accountable for enterprise risk management. And I can kind of see the accountant's role branching out, and companies, especially smaller to mid-sized companies, requiring more of their accounting departments, or seeing more responsibility in areas that maybe traditionally were thought of as finance positions. So you think of things like inventory management or reporting management, or IT is another one, like the de facto IT person in a small business might be the accountant. Oh, you know how to handle the computer. You're on it 24 hours a day, So I think as either internally or externally as an accountant, you kind of need to keep that in mind, that even though you're providing a service, people may, and you think it's all just numbers and finance, people may be, their idea of what you do or what you're responsible for can be different from what you're actually offering. And to keep that in mind when you're engaging and when you're selling your services, to either make that clear that you don't cover that, or that you have it addressed in some way, I guess was one angle that I found kind of surprising or eye-raising that I didn't expect to see in the article.
Yeah, I think chopping these up into 6 megatrends might have been a little bit much, because I think some of these are so generic that I can't think of a year when you don't have an increasing amount of automation, or you don't have an increasing demand for upskilling and continuing education for professionals. It's like every year they demand more of that from accountants. And I think, some of them specifically speak to 2020, and I agree that some of these trends are coming to pass, like remote work, but we kind of see a lot of these types of articles at year end, like top 10 lists of what an accountant's going to do next year, that kind of thing.
All right, Charlie, you got another article for us?
Yeah, I can do another one. So I found an article in Market Watch called Why an Elon Musk Tweet Led to a 5,675% Surge in Signal Advances Stock. And so basically, Elon Musk tweeted the words "use Signal." That's all he said. And what he was referring to is an encrypted messaging service that's like an alternative to Twitter. And it's called Signal, but it's a 501c3. It's not publicly traded. And what investors took it to mean was that there's a separate company that has nothing to do with them called Signal Advance it's a biotech company. And basically investors are so quick to jump on anything that Elon Musk says that basically that stock, shot through the roof. And so it went from having a market cap of 55 million all the way up to 3.164 billion in a very short period of time after this tweet. And since then it has, people noticed right away that actually wasn't even that company, Signal Advance, the biotech company, put out a statement saying, hey, that's not us. It's great that you want to invest in us, but we just want to invest in your privacy, and we're 501c3, so you can't. And even after that, the Signal Advance stock has continued to do great. And so the reason I kind of wanted to bring this up is because, in accounting, we're often taught to think about market value as something we kind of hold sacred. And we are often comparing things to market value to determine what it's really worth. And a lot of times that makes good sense. But at the same time, we have these sorts of events where we figure out that, the market doesn't act on perfect information. It doesn't act rationally. And even sometimes when it does something wrong and you tell it that it's wrong, it still just goes, I don't care. I'm just going to keep doing that anyway. And so I guess I want to get your guys' take on whether or not you can trust market value in general if we have these kind of things happen that make it seem like it just means nothing.
Well, I'll be honest, when I read this article, it reminded me of the old quote, I don't care what they say about me in the paper, just as long as they spell my name right, and it was a boost for this Signal, the biotech company, for, a boon to their mediocre stock, I guess, for lack of a better word, if you look at the pie or the chart that's included in the article. But I think I think market share, when you talk about market share or something like that, if you want to talk about Signal's, for lack of a better word, and no pun intended, being boosted by this Elon Musk tweet, I guarantee you that their fundraising arm of the 501c3 is probably their phone's ringing off the hook. It's not hard to get donations or grants for Signal right now because of the media exposure of this. And I'm sure the biotech company Signal Advanced isn't complaining either that people are just pouring money or buying their stock or making their stock shares rise just because they got confused with the Signal that's the nonprofit and thought that they were a publicly traded company, and nobody bothered to check that they're a biotech company and not an encrypted message service. So I think this even goes back to, you talk about opportunity in the time of, people maybe turning away from Twitter or not trusting big tech. You have an opportunity here by Signal that's a 501c3 to get donations and for people to be using your platform because of people leaving either another platform or looking for an alternative. So I think it's a really good, kind of manifestation of what we talked about earlier in the podcast, but as well as I think, having your name spelled right may be a boon for both somebody that has a similar name and yourself, and having all eyes on you. I mean, this last week, I've heard the Signal name from podcasts I've listened to, Twitter, this article. It's been all over the place. And, 2 weeks ago, if you asked me what Signal was, either the biotech company or the 501c3 messaging company, I would have had no idea. So I think, any kind of media attention could be good media attention in this case, so I don't know. I think it's good for everybody all the way around, I guess. I'm having a hard time seeing a downside to this.
No, and I think the other benefit is for our at-home users who are playing the drinking game every time we bring up a story about the gig economy or Elon Musk.
I think that's the takeaway for me, the fact that Elon Musk has so much influence, right? Because you look at it, look at the oil. I don't know if you trade the oil industry, but they sit there and they've got flags every time there's news because news moves the oil market. Apparently, Elon Musk has the ability to move stocks up and down. I guess it's great to have that. It's good to be king, I suppose. But I'll get us rolling into our next article unless somebody else has something to say on it. All right. So here's one. Let's show of hands out there. Is anybody sick and tired of paying for all these gaudy Washington politicians' pensions and retirement plans and benefits and salaries? It's kind of interesting. I in my lifetime, I don't think I've ever seen political parties so, I guess, unresponsive to their constituents, and I think it crosses party lines. I think every politician in Washington is generally tone deaf with everything that probably happens outside of a 50-mile radius of Washington D.C. I really don't think they're in tune with what's going on with the country, but people go through, they struggle, their businesses are shut down. Loss of a ton of income with this whole COVID thing. And in the meanwhile, it seems like every year Congress votes themselves a raise and people keep paying and you don't really see a whole lot of backlash to it. Same thing happens every election cycle. The incumbents seem to rule the roost. What do you guys think about that?
Well, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but I have to say that it's very difficult. I guess the people that are inclined to be a public servant, and that goes for being, the executive director of a nonprofit or working in politics or being a local, kind of politician or anything like that. It's a very difficult job to sign up for, to be honest. I mean, of course, I think, like Jack said, I think a lot of these people are tone deaf, but I think that it's very hard to attract good talent, I guess, is because if you have the skill set to do these jobs, you can go to the private sector and get paid quite a bit of money to do the same kind with the same kind of qualifications that it takes to be a politician or even like the CEO of a company. If we're doing the nonprofit executive director to public company CFO, I think a lot of the skill sets are the same there. I think what drives people into either of those camps of either being a public servant or like the executive director of a nonprofit is, at least in the beginning, public service. They want to do a public service. And I think, at the end of the day, they need to be compensated at least closely to what their private sector counterparts are to be able to attract the best and brightest in the bunch. And so I think when you're talking about pension plans or anything like that, I think, in a situation like this, I think it's easy to look at how much somebody's going to make. But if you look at, like, for instance, the Oregon PERS, where most of us are based out of Oregon, Oregon PERS 1 was the retirement and pension policy for Oregon. And you have like PE teachers that retired 10 years ago that have $1 million pensions because it was set aside and promised for them. And I don't necessarily know if that's a good or bad thing. It was just how it was sketched out in the retirement to incentivize them to be teachers or public servants. So I don't necessarily know that how much Nancy Pelosi or anybody else makes after retirement, or how much the American taxpayer is paying into that. I think what would be a better measure is an outside of Washington or a private sector job that would be amalgamous to what they're doing. Are they getting paid more or less than that? And I think that would probably be a better measure of whether or not it's fair, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and I think to add to the mix, I think it's interesting that the approval ratings for Congress as a whole are always hit these record lows. Like, nobody likes the institution of Congress as a whole. But then when individuals are asked, but do you like your congressperson, almost to a person, they say, yeah. And the individual is much higher than the group as a whole. So I think it's easy to pile on to the group as a whole and to look at Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi, and depending on which side of the fence you are, think, it's not right what they're getting paid. And I think, it's really interesting when you look at the discrepancies of how much they're actually earning annually and how much their net worth is, because that money is coming from somewhere else, and which masters are they actually serving. But on an individual by individual basis, I kind of have to fall in AJ's camp and say, these people who are intelligent enough on both sides of the aisle to be running, to be charismatic enough to make change and to get people to vote for them and put themselves out so publicly, are only going to do so if they're compensated. And, they aren't getting paid as much as they would in the private sector. So, I'm maybe straddling the fence on my opinion here, but I see the reason for it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think just summarizing what I hear everyone saying, and that kind of falls in line with what I think is, like, whether they're getting paid enough or too much depends on your assessment of their performance, right? and that becomes somewhat of a political question, and so yeah, I mean, I think, but if you kind of set that aside, you said, well, if they were performing adequately, that may be a big if for some people, but just assume if they were performing adequately, then what would you say the compensation should be, including these retirement packages? I mean, I think, yeah, it seems like if you want the right talent in there, it's got to be competitive with other things these people could be doing, right? Or other things that people that you would want doing that job could be doing. I would just add that, the article that we were looking at, actually, the way it was titled was, "Why are U.S. taxpayers providing public pension to millionaires in Congress?" And so, I mean, it's a leading question, as if every member of Congress is a millionaire, and yes, there's a lot of them that are, but not necessarily every single one. And so I guess, would the answer be different if the member of Congress wasn't a millionaire? I mean, it seems like what our crew is saying is, yeah, it doesn't matter whether they come to Congress with what net worth they come to Congress with. That's not the issue. It's what is their performance, and is it comparable? Are they getting paid comparably to what they would otherwise get paid for comparable performance? We're focusing in on that issue, not on what their beginning net worth was. Sounds good to me.
Well, it's funny. I mean, I guess my perception is that the concept of Mr. Smith goes to Washington is dead. I mean, that at one point people wanted to make a change. They went to Washington. We've kind of talked around it here a little bit. I think that what's interesting is the millions and millions of dollars that are raised to run campaigns to secure a $250,000 a year job, and then take that $250,000 a year job and fast forward 20 or 30 years, and these people are millionaires multiple times over. It raises many questions. And I think, AJ, I see what you're saying. I think when things come down to more of a micro level or a local level, if you will, you do have that people have a genuine interest in improving things in their community. It's interesting. I just had a meeting with a local mayor of a small town. I was kind of surprised that he was only a part-time mayor because it's a pretty fair-sized city. Well, he also runs an insurance company. So I was kind of teasing him a little bit. I'm like, well, geez, how the heck do you find time to do both? And, he's forever getting sucked into mayor business. And, his first, he tried to actually change the city and cut some costs and get rid of what he saw were redundant resources. And, they tried to throw him out. They tried to recall on him in his first year. It's like, I said, well, geez, are you going to run again? But his point to getting into, public service was to make a change and do some good. But, when I just look at some of these Washington politicians and I just see them as out of touch and the numbers to me don't add up. To spend that kind of money to secure that type of job and to build that type of wealth sitting there 20 or 30 years just doesn't add up to me.
All right. I think I got one more article. This is a little bit more of an advice article, maybe end on a little bit of a lighter note today. Earn more from your bookkeeping cleanup projects. So this is from Accounting Web. And I thought this was interesting because it's kind of geared at those of us who are taking on clients to do their year-end accounting. And this could be at a firm, this could be, at a smaller company like ours. But the basic gist, the bottom line of this is that you should be eliminating high maintenance, low profit clients and looking at implementing value pricing. And rather than trying to bill hourly and figure out how many hours you have for each client, try to come at it from the other side where you're determining what your value is to the client and determine what that value is worth. And don't necessarily look at somebody's books on an initial consult and say, I can do this for X number of dollars, or I can do this in X number of hours. But, look at the books, say, I'll get back to you with pricing, sit with it, really come up with what the value added proposition is that you're bringing to their company, and then come back to them. And that will help them understand the value that you can create, as well as avoid you getting into situations where you're just trying to churn out the hours and trying to stay under a certain budgeted number of hours. And, there's room for both, but I think the move toward the value proposition is an interesting one to me.
I think I generally agree with the idea of trying to pose it as kind of a value-based approach, because I think it makes the most sense. The only kind of caveat to that is I would say it all depends on your ability to kind of estimate what you think that project will take, because by saying what you think the value is and then relating that to what how much you want to make out of it, basically is going to drive how many hours you think you're going to put into it. And so I think as long as you're doing that right, then and you're coming close to what you've estimated, then this makes a lot of sense. You should bill according to what you're bringing to the table. But to the extent that you can't do that accurately, I think you set yourself up for, traps, basically. What do you think, AJ?
Man, I have to go the complete opposite way, just because I guess I've been involved with so many cleanup projects, I guess, in an outsourced accounting sense, that, a client's going to show you they're going to put on a good poker face and tell you everything's fine. They just need a few year-end adjustments, and that's all they need. But their sister's brother has been keeping up the books for the last 6 months since their CFO left and stormed out, and then you get in there thinking you got 6 hours of work, and 20 hours later, you're scratching your head like, where'd the time go? And oh my gosh, this is so screwed up. So I think, we've talked on this podcast before, value-based pricing versus, per hourly. And I think especially with outsourced accounting work where you're stepping in and doing the job of like a bookkeeper or a contract CFO or anything like that you're doing, I think it's much easier to bill on an hourly basis and show somebody what you did during those hours than it is to try and estimate what the value is you're providing somebody to fix up the books. Now you can adjust your hourly rates at what you think it would cost them to have somebody in that seat doing that year round, and you're coming in at the end of the year to be the savior and clean it up. Your high level accountant for the year part-time would be $40,000. You're only going to charge them, 20 hours, at $200 an hour or whatever to clean it up. that's going to be less than what they would have paid a CFO level or controller level person to be there all year to hold their hand through all of this. I think that's a good starting point to know if what you're charging them is reasonable. But I think value-based for outsourced accounting is very difficult. When you talk about like tax planning or some kind of like, like an engagement that would net them a certain amount of money and you can sketch out how much that's going to be, that's much easier to assign a value based pricing to them and say, hey, listen, we can probably get you in the ballpark of X amount of dollars and we'll only charge you X amount of dollars to do so. And you can show them at the end of the day, net, you'll receive X amount of money. I think that's a much easier sell than saying, I'll clean up your books for however much money. And then you find yourself stuck, working for minimum wage or less than, because the problems within their books or the problems within their accounting system are so much more overblown than what they led you to believe. I think, yeah. So I guess my rambling here is just to say that I think from an outsourced or a contract accounting perspective of like what the bookkeeper, I guess, saying is that it's probably better to bill on an hourly basis. But I think you need to really do a deep dive on what you're providing and what your clients' needs are before you come at them with a value-based kind of approach.
Yeah, I'd say that's 100%. I mean, I can say I have really sharp opinions on this issue because we've used it in defining our pricing structure for our firm. And we provide what we call CFO advisory services, and we provide outsourced accounting. And we do use value-based billing for our advisory services, and alternatively, we used hourly-based billing for outsourced accounting, and that's very intentional because of some theories that we have and that we share. And I'll kind of line out a couple of things here in terms of my beliefs on these things. My beliefs, which are evolving, and certainly certainly can always change over time, of course, too. But the thing is that when we do value-based billing in an advisory capacity, what makes that possible in an advisory capacity is because there's two key components. Number one is that to do value-based billing, I believe you have to be able to agree with the client on an overall objective of what you're trying to achieve together with the client. And the client has to be willing to let you drive the process to achieve that objective. And so it's very different to get hired by a client to achieve an objective than it is to get hired by a client to perform certain tasks. And so one of the authors that I've read extensively on this topic of value-based billing in the consulting world, he references it as, his name's Alan Weiss, and he references it as the difference between doing advisory and doing delivery work. And I think we got to be careful not to disparage delivery work, because we actually make a lot of money off doing delivery work. So there's nothing wrong with it, right? But it's different. And so I don't think you can be super successful at value-based billing on delivery work. And so you got to be very clear about what it is you're actually doing in order to fit your pricing model to what that is. And so beyond having that objective, it's also helpful if what you're basically doing advisory on is something that there is market demand for, and there's not a huge amount of competition for it, or the field is not overly crowded. Now, in saying that, there's nothing we do, even at the highest end advisory, even if I sat down and did a really detailed, really complicated consulting with a client on mergers and acquisitions and their international tax structure and so on, there for sure is somebody else in town that could actually do that, right? So there's always some competition going on there, but the number of people that can do that is far less than the number of people who can close a set of books. And that's a really important point, because when you get into actually talking about like what we do under outsourced accounting, closing a set of books, cleaning up the set of books, the reality of that, it's all well and good to talk about value-based billing, but the reality of it is that there's a lot of competition in that place. What we know is there's not much competition of people who do it right, but there's a lot of noise in the market, right? There's a lot of people who actually are out there. So I think there's a perception when it comes to closing books that it's a commodity, which makes it very difficult to do that in a value-based way. The other piece, though, is that it is getting at kind of what AJ was talking about. It's very difficult when you're cleaning up the books or being hired to do bookkeeping with a client to actually agree on an objective, and then for the client to let you just work toward that objective the way you think is best. Because especially when you're doing more operational accounting, you often have to bend yourself to the way they do things in their business, the way their operations work. And more often than not, the entrepreneur or the business operator has this list of things they want you to do, which may not really be in the scope of whatever your objective was in terms of cleaning up the books. And so I think it's just the inherent, when a client or a prospect says, we want you to clean up the books or we want you to do the bookkeeping, there's often, I think this is what AJ was getting at, there's often a lot loaded in that statement that we can't come to an actual mutual agreement on what the objective is in real time. I mean, it's very difficult to do that. And so really the only way from my perspective to then help the client at that point is just have them pay you for the hours. And I think that, I think there's this thought in our industry right now that it's an all or nothing proposition. You should be doing nothing but value billing. And that's the only thing that's the only way to do it. And that's the only way you make money. And I would say we make a lot of money off billing by the hour. So it's okay. It's okay. We can do it. It's just, it depends on what we're doing. You have to match your pricing strategy to what you're actually doing is my 2 cents on it.
Yeah. And I think you absolutely have to match. I think what you said there was really poignant. Like this isn't heads or tails. You don't have to pick one or the other. You can do both. You don't have to sign up for the value-based Kool-Aid and only drink that. You can definitely offer different services for different prices. Nobody said that accounting firms have to be an all-you-can-eat buffet.
And let me jump into that point. We've actually done both. We've worked with clients where they engage us for a CFO advisory project on a fixed value-based fee, and they also pay us by the hour to clean up their books at the same time. So, it's definitely not that you have to do both.
Ty, I think you hit the key word was commodity, and that's, I think every accounting firm out there has that same challenge. How do you knock down that perception that you're a commodity? And we've all heard you're a bean counter, and that's what people think. Whether you're the CFO of a company or a bookkeeper, a lot of these clients will see you as just a bookkeeper, and it's, how do you present? I can remember over 20 years ago working at a small family business and actually putting in an ERP system, but to the mother, her perception was all I did was play on the computer all day. So I think as an accountant, your challenge is, how do you, don't allow yourself to be painted in that corner that people see you as a commodity.
Well, and I think, Jack, to your point, I think you need to brand yourself and show that you're not just a commodity. I think one of the reasons why we're able to charge the price we do is because we have overqualified people that can see more than what just a bookkeeper would see. You're hiring for your cleanup job or your hourly accounting sort of job, for lack of a better word, outsourced accounting or outsourced bookkeeping. You have somebody at a controller or CFO or CPA level accountant doing quote unquote your bookkeeping. And so there's efficiencies to be gained there. And there's definitely more of the picture can be seen as you're doing that work than somebody who just is considered a debits and credits kind of accountant.
Thank you for joining us again this week on another broadcast of None of Our Businesses. Catch us on the YouTube channel. Go ahead and hit us, like us, follow us, share us, tell your friends about us. You can look at current events and viewed through the eyes of an accountant and how they affect your business. We'll catch you next week. Thanks for joining us this week. Go Browns.